Hello, and welcome to Vital, your one-stop shop for scorching hot health and wellness takes and deep dives into what I would consider essential wellness topics. I'm Val, your host. Let's get right into it. So I thought long and hard about which topic to pick for my first episode, and I really wanted to start off with a bang, but more than anything else, I kind of just wanted to start some drama. So I've decided to make my first episode about citric acid because of its ubiquitous nature and seemingly harmless reputation, although I'm here to dispel all of that. As a general disclaimer, this is not health advice. I don't give health advice. I don't want to give health advice. I'm just here to inform, entertain, and say many unsettling things. I originally fell down the citric acid rabbit hole because my friends would complain about bloating, stomach pain, and asthma symptoms after consuming certain foods and drinks where there weren't really other ingredients that could be causing those reactions. And there's certainly a plethora of ingredients out there that can induce those symptoms, but I think we need to dunk on citric acid a little bit more for its role in digestive issues, and honestly, a whole lot of other issues too. If you have consumed food in this century and have perused the label, you might have seen citric acid in a wide array of food products, and that is because it's a really common flavor enhancer and preservative that's used in just about everything. And while the name might suggest that it's a derivative of the wonderfully delicious and absolutely harmless citrus fruit, the truth is, as the iconic Oscar Wilde would say, rarely pure and never simple. First, we need to dive a little bit into the history because it really sets the stage for the unhinged mess that is the citric acid industry. Citric acid has gone through numerous iterations over the decades, and it's not really the lemon juice adjacent that many people probably think it still is. It was originally discovered in the 8th century by an Islamic alchemist, which, unrelated commentary, but the term alchemist goes so hard, and I personally think we need to bring it back. But despite being discovered in the 8th century, the chemical isolation of it didn't occur until the late 1700s by a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who isolated it from lemon juice. But it was the 1700s, and they had exactly zero use for citric acid, so kind of nothing really happened for a long time. However, about 100 years later, around 1890, there was a higher demand for preservatives, and so industrial scale manufacturing began, and it was very dependent on the Italian citrus fruit industry. Then in 1893, Carl Weimer, a different Carl by the way, there are more men named Carl in the story than women. Carl here discovered that penicillium mold could produce citric acid from sugar, but this process wasn't adopted because it was really hard to implement on a commercial scale. So he was voted off the island. Better luck next time, Carl. So this is where the story starts to get a little bit more interesting, because around the same time in the late 1800s, Pfizer, yes, that Pfizer, began to manufacture citric acid also from Italian citrus fruit, just as the soft drink industry was starting to boom and people were becoming addicted to cocaine soda, which honestly, I get it, I respect it. At the time, Pfizer was still a relatively new chemical company, and they had only made a few successful drugs. So this industrial production of citric acid was a really big hit, and it led to a lot of financial success for them and kind of put them on the map in a way that allowed them to exponentially grow as a household name. However, what comes up must come down, and because of the First World War, there were supply chain disruptions in Italy, which meant citrus fruit no more. Pfizer was down bad, but never one to be deterred from a profit. They hired a food chemist named James Curie, who discovered that citric acid could actually be obtained from feeding sugar to Aspergillus niger, also known as black mold. Keep that little nugget in the back of your head for later on because this is a really important development in the story. So our man James single-handedly caused a huge turning point for the citric acid industry because it meant that they didn't have to keep using expensive lemons and they could substitute them for cheap crops like corn, which honestly is not surprising to anybody because we all know these companies love to cut any possible quality corners. And so Pfizer scaled up the production of citric acid using this new fermentation process, and the price dropped like the New Year's ball in Times Square from $1.25 per pound to about 20 cents per pound. And this is where it all goes downhill for us, the consumers, because this cost reduction made processed packaged foods even more attractive to manufacturers. So as a result, we were set on this path where ultimately the market is filled with cheap processed quote-unquote food. I am nothing if not a lover of a well-placed statistic, so fast forward to this century, the citric acid industry brought in about $2.5 billion per year in 2016 and is set to make about $3.9 billion in the year of our Lord 2024. And I ran the numbers through a calculator because I'm not doing that in my head, and that's about a 56% increase in just 8 years. I should also mention that Pfizer doesn't bring in the big bucks with this anymore, and China is actually the biggest producer, as they control about 60% of the market. All right, so now that we've covered all the essential historical lore, let's get into some of the questionable legal and political decisions the potential health implications of consuming citric acid, and also the process of how it's made. Because if there's one thing I love, it's yapping about the food system and manufacturing processes in excruciating detail. So, citric acid holds the status of GRAS, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe, which is a really interesting FDA categorization that I will verbally eviscerate at a later date. My Nancy Drew levels of investigation have revealed that there aren't any long-term studies on consuming large amounts of citric acid, which begs the question of how it can be considered generally safe in the absence of evidence that I would personally consider crucial. Riddle me that, FDA. And you know what? Backing up a bit, I'm actually not done with the history lesson after all, so class is back in session. The standard production process for manufactured citric acid, where the black mold is used, has been around since 1919, which is long before the FDA had its fingers in the food additive safety pie. It wasn't even until the late 50s that the FDA even created a food additive amendment, and Congress, always at the scene of the crime, excluded a number of additives from having to go through FDA evaluation if they were in use prior to 1958. And nobody died eating it. So they basically grandfathered it in after it had been in use with no studies for the better part of half a century. This isn't illegal, but I feel like it should be. So since being given this GRAS status, citric acid has not been studied. It actually was never really studied in the first place, and certainly no new studies that have come out have been taken into consideration by the FDA because it still retains its GRAS status, which is extremely concerning considering that 70% of the yearly world supply is used for food and beverages. I believe we're currently producing something like 2.5 million tons, which I can't even really quantify, so let's look this up together. So 1 ton is how many? Okay, 1 ton is 2,000 pounds. I can't even comprehend how much that is. I think that's how much a small car might weigh. All right, so according to the World Wide Web, 2.5 million tons is 5 billion with a B pounds, and 70% of 5 billion, because that's how much we consume on a yearly basis, is 3.5 billion tons. That doesn't even begin to account for the amount that we slather on our bodies through cosmetics and personal care products, but I digress. So that 56% increase in revenue from 2016 to 2024 that I mentioned earlier is not only due to price increases, which huge shout out to the Fed for inflation, by the way, couldn't have done it without you. It's also because the use of citric acid is skyrocketing. So to show you the prevalence of citric acid in your daily life, put my lovely voice on pause, make it over to your fridge and or pantry, and let's look at some of the ingredients together. So you might be noticing that citric acid is in your little treats, the 20 different kinds of beverages I know you will have, those little electrolyte powders, and even in your protein powder and pre-workouts. And it's not just in highly processed foods, it's also likely in your frozen fruits and vegetables as well. However, I have been recently informed by a friend that the Whole Foods branded frozen fruit have been marked safe from the citric acid plague. So aside from food and beverages, which includes wine, my deepest condolences, it's also found in cosmetics and personal care products and even supplements and pharmaceuticals. So now citric acid is not only ingested, but it's applied directly to the skin. And it just so happens that our skin has a tendency to absorb whatever is applied topically. And depending on the substance, transdermal absorption can actually be higher than oral absorption. In fact, if you're a Pinterest girl like me, then at the tender age of 14, you probably went into Michael's and bought a 5-pound bag of the stuff to DIY your own little fizzy bath bombs, and then spent the next several weeks turning the bathtub into a crime scene with red dye number 40. I'd like to make a formal apology to my mother. So sorry, Mom. So to take our little experiment further, I would encourage you to try tracking how many products you consume or use that have manufactured citric acid in them over a course of a week. Or a month if you're an overachiever. If I have any talented and gifted and talented Mensa listeners out there. Those little amounts in each product add up very quickly, and you're going to be amazed of how much of this stuff you are likely consuming on a regular basis. And if you actually do this, shoot me an email because I am kind of curious. All right, so finally getting into the actual health effects of citric acid. There have been numerous studies linking the consumption of it to symptoms like acid reflux, nausea, stomach pain, cramps, and even hives. And this is because Aspergillus niger is an allergen for one, because it's toxic mold. And about a quarter of the US population can't actually properly detox mold via normal organ processes due to a genetic predisposition. Those are generally the people who are more sensitive to mold and can develop allergic reactions to it. However, anyone can technically have a reaction or develop an allergy because, once again, it's a toxic mold. And these allergies and intolerances can actually start from a very young age because, long nail drumroll please, most baby food contains citric acid. Straight to jail for whoever decided that. I'm just going to repeat that one more time for dramatic effect, that baby food has a GMO corn and mold derivative as a preservative. Do with that information what you will. As mentioned earlier, citric acid can be really irritating to the intestinal tract and the stomach lining. So if you're someone who already has issues with inflammation, issues like GERD or IBS, or if you're worried about your gut health, this would definitely be an additive to stay away from. Like, run, don't walk. So these digestive issues can occur because citric acid, you guessed it, has acidic properties that can cause irritation. So for one, it can directly impact the tissue and cause almost like a burning sensation. And secondly, it can actually alter the natural pH levels of the stomach and interfere with digestive enzymes, which typically leads to various digestive issues like acid reflux, heartburn, bloating, and so on. And this is just citric acid on its own, by the way. Then you throw in the little bit about the mold and it gets exponentially worse, but I'll cover that in just a minute. So there was one particular study, albeit small, that found that manufactured citric acid could actually be the culprit behind patients' complaints of joint pain, respiratory distress, cramping, and muscular pain. And there were actually a few case studies done where patients with joint pain and muscular pain stopped eating all food that contained citric acid, and all their symptoms magically went away. I will let you come to your own conclusions about that. There are also some new reports now coming out stating that manufactured citric acid can actually increase the skin sensitivity to UVB radiation, which means it increases the likelihood of getting skin damage from the sun. And the way that this occurs is citric acid could potentially disrupt the skin's natural barrier function and or increase its permeability. So that just makes it more sensitive to UV radiation when you're out and about. It may also have photochemical properties that interact with UVB radiation, which can lead to increased oxidative stress and inflammation in the skin. So if you're in your retinal era and you care about reducing signs of aging in your skin, the last thing you want is oxidative stress levels increasing. This is not conducive to a hot girl summer, so proceed accordingly. All right, so back to the whole mold situation. Aspergillus niger produces a mycotoxin called ochratoxin A, and a mycotoxin is just a toxin that comes from a fungus. So ochratoxin A has been associated with kidney and liver toxicity and is also likely carcinogenic, which means it can potentially cause cancer. Ochratoxin A is also bioaccumulative, which means it can accumulate in the body over time with frequent exposure. Not unlike the rage that accumulates in my body the longer that I talk about citric acid. So typically the liver and the kidneys would actually filter out toxins like this. However, about a quarter of the US population has something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which means that the liver isn't as performant and can't filter toxins out of the body properly. In my humble professional opinion, the official number is rather low, and I would personally tack on another 25 to 30% for people who don't even know they have suboptimal liver function. So let's just say conservatively, half of the US population has decreased liver function. If you combine that with the mycotoxins that are also attacking the liver, you have the perfect storm to decrease the liver's ability to detox properly. In my opinion, a health catastrophe of biblical proportions. At this point, there are some people that would normally be lunging at my throat saying, but they purified the citric acid, Val, and it's refined, so there's no mold spores left. False. Because this particular strain that's used for citric acid production is extremely thermotolerant. So it's very likely that not all of it is getting neutralized during the process. Not only that, but Aspergillus niger has actually been shown to still trigger reactions even when it is killed off at the recommended temperatures during the refining process. So this mold residue could be extremely problematic for those with mold sensitivity or an already impaired immune system, especially if you have something like Hashimoto's or other autoimmune issues, or those that have not yet developed a good immune system, like let's say an infant who is being fed Gerber. So let's get into the mechanics of how this is actually produced, because it's imperative that you understand just how much worse this gets, and boy does it get worse. So the typical process for making citric acid goes something like this, although it can vary slightly depending on the manufacturer. So corn is soaked in water with sulfur dioxide to remove the corn kernel, and the remaining liquor is what's used to make the citric acid. So then the mold strain is introduced into the liquor, and the citric acid is created through fermentation, which honestly kind of reminds me of kombucha. and then it's harvested and supposedly purified. However, during this process, the corn protein gets completely degraded, and manufacturers don't typically remove this remaining protein, which leads to the protein becoming hydrolyzed, which means that there is now free glutamic acid floating around, aka MSG, in the citric acid. So citric acid can also react with other proteins it comes in contact with, like in processed food, and that can actually free up even more glutamic acid. So because this manufactured citric acid contains MSG, it is now considered an excitotoxin. And an excitotoxin is just a type of chemical that overstimulates our neuron receptors. And in the case of food additives, they're used to excite the neurons on your tongue, so you want to eat more processed food. Unfortunately, this leads to rapid cell nerve death because the cells are quite literally stimulated to death. How fun! Too much of this can lead to brain and nerve damage, and I don't know about you, but I personally don't have any extra brain cells to spare, so I will be holding tightly onto mine. Another little interesting fun fact about citric acid is that in the presence of sodium benzoate, which is often used in soft drinks, it can create benzene, which is a known carcinogen. And this conversion can actually take place directly in the drink container while on a store shelf. So the next time you're reaching for one of your favorite little fizzy treats, you might be consuming cancer-causing ingredients. Although absolutely nobody has asked, I'm still going to tell you anyway. Why use corn for this process? For one, corn is heavily subsidized, which makes it one of the most cost-effective ingredients for manufacturers. Secondly, the variety of corn that's used on an industrial scale is called yellow dent corn or field corn, and it's really high in starch, which makes it attractive for producers of citric acid, high fructose corn syrup, and other pillars of the American diet. And the black mold used in citric acid production has also gone through numerous rounds of genetic modification to increase yields. And one of the processes used is gamma radiation in order to mutate the mold strain to improve yields. Kind of have to respect the hustle. However, due to FDA loopholes, not the last time you'll be hearing about those, citric acid from GMO corn is allowed to be labeled non-GMO. And yet another quick reminder that this is added to baby food, and the companies that put no MSG on their labels are actually legally allowed to add citric acid into their products, even though there could actually be MSG in there from the manufacturing process. This is more of an aside, but I definitely think it should be emphasized that when we consume these various additives, the impact might not be apparent immediately. You might not feel really sick at first because it's working on a smaller scale in your body to create this inflammation, but that can lead to bigger problems later on. However, if you are experiencing pain or discomfort or worsened asthma after you eat food, that's not normal and your body is trying to tell you something. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with citric acid from natural sources like citrus fruit or other acidic foods like tomatoes, unless you're consuming just copious amounts of it. There can actually be some health benefits to consuming citric acid, but the issues really arise when it's derived from GMO corn and black mold. The chemical formula for natural and manufactured citric acid is actually the exact same. So the problem really is just in the procurement and manufacturing process and the obvious risk of mold contamination. However, if you do want to get the benefits of citric acid, perhaps consider adding some fruit into your diet. Now, there are some companies that use citrus-derived citric acid, but the labeling won't often indicate that. Just off the top of my head, I can think of maybe 2 or 3 companies that do in fact use citrus-derived citric acid, but that's pretty much it. The only way to know for sure is to contact the company directly and ask for a certificate of analysis to verify their source. Now, if they refuse to send you a certificate because they either don't have one, or my personal favorite excuse is that they're not allowed to share that with you, that kind of tells you everything you need to know. If they do send you a certificate of analysis, just be sure that it contains the name of the lab that did the results and the phone number and address for the lab that did the results so that you can call and verify. I'm not saying you need to call and verify, but that information should be there. And if it's not, like if they're hiding the lab information, more likely than not, the certificate is fabricated and the company is lying. And this happens a lot more frequently than you think. Personally, my inbox is full of me going back and forth with some of these brands arguing about their sourcing. Also, generally, you do want them to be using an organic source to avoid glyphosate exposure because citrus fruit is heavily sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. If you have an overabundance of time on your hands, or if you just enjoy being a general nuisance like I do, you can actually request that the brand change the type of citric acid that they use. And then if enough consumers ask, they kind of have to do it to stay relevant and also competitive. That is all I have for you today. I hope this has been informative. And if you liked the episode, please like, subscribe, and share with all your friends, enemies, and coworkers. And I'll see you again next week.